Yes, please. Thank you for taking your seats. We're about to start the next session. People are getting ready. Yes, I think so. It's the last conversations. I know we are keeping you long today for interesting discussions, but let us start with the third and last panel of today, which I will be moderating myself. I hope absolutely that your energy is not running out yet, because you need to get ready for this panel. We will now look further into the action plan on human rights and democracy, which many of you may have under your pillow at night. And of course also the important midterm review that is coming up, and which will be the last step before thinking about developing the next action plan. So the objective of this session is to explore with the panelists how the action plan and its policy processes can help raising democracy as a priority of EU leadership, and what steps such efforts should comprise of. As many of you know, indeed, the ongoing midterm review will conclude by June, if I'm not mistaken, July, potentially with political council conclusions. Soon after, the first steps will indeed be taken to draft the next action plan, and then it will of course soon arrive also on the plate of the member states for in various bodies to discuss and negotiate. So this panel will look at that, and it will also look at what the action plan can mean for various stakeholders, for instance, as an advocacy tool, and also how the ownership of the action plan at EU institutional level and at member state levels can be further strengthened throughout the process. We will further discuss a few relevant recommendations from the report that directly relate to the process of that action plan. So I greatly count on the panelists for doing this, and you're all strong democracy supporters, that is proven, and also with a sound sense of realism, since you have either been through the institutional processes before yourself or you are very familiar with it. So, welcome very warmly Ambassador Mikael Lindvall from Sweden, Neal, Ambassador Delphine Borione from France, Lisbeth Pilegaard from the Danish Institute for Parties and Democracy, and Papuashvili from the International Partnership for Human Rights. Our first speaker will be Ambassador Mikael Lindvall, and he will need to apologize because his PSC meeting will start again at 4 o'clock sharp, so he will need to leave us at 4 sharp. So therefore we start with your intervention, Ambassador. Ambassador Lindvall is the head of section of Foreign and Security Policy of the Permanent Representation of Sweden. So he represents indeed Sweden in the PSC committee since September 2017. Ambassador, I have the pleasure to pass on the floor to you for your opening statement.
Thank you. Thanks, Marilyn, and good to see so many friends and colleagues here. The problem with coming in here at the end, and you've all spent a long day here, is of course that many things will have been said already, and I hopefully won't repeat them. Very quickly, just a few things from both my own and the Swedish and the PSC perspective, perhaps. First of all, to say that we think that the IDEA report is really, really very useful, very well written, very substantial, and very helpful. We see that there is a changed geopolitical landscape, which certainly forces us to reflect on our policies and our tools in order to make sure that we try to become better and better. The recommendations are, of course, really, really important for the midterm review of the EU Action Plan on Human Rights and Democracy, and we will try to use it to calibrate our policies for the rest of the implementation period, and will also, of course, be important as we look forward to the next action plan. A couple of things coming out of the recommendations that I'd like to point out in particular, which make good sense to us. I think my State Secretary this morning spoke about this, the need for a new narrative for democracy, and the fact that research shows that democracy delivers very, very clear and tangible results for people, including social and economic development, the strengthening of gender equality, peace and security, and so on. So there is an evidence base that we need to use, that we need to communicate, and perhaps also do that with a higher degree of humility than we have done previously. I'll come back to this a bit and how we try to handle this within my committee and also in our advice to the EAS and to the Commission and so on. We're also clear, of course, that the European Union needs to be guided by democracy and human rights in all the areas of foreign policy, and that we should not see this as separate portions of what we do, but indeed integrated into all parts of EU foreign and security policy, and that we all have that responsibility to carry those policies forward also bilaterally. I think also we have to be honest that there will be clashes between policy goals, and we have to be honest about that and talk about that. It's something which we spend lots of time on also in my committee. We also are very strong supporters of the recommendation to strengthen civil society involvement as we try to develop and move forward on our policies within democracy and human rights. A lot has already been done, and I think we have to thank the EAS and the Commission for all its efforts around this, but we also think that more could be done to have a more structured and inclusive dialogue with civil society. One of the ideas that IDEA presents is the one of taking this cohort thing forward from the Summit of Democracies. I think that's something which is worth looking at least. When it comes specifically to the midterm review of the action plan, a few things. First of all, we think that the current action plan is strong and good. It's a good tool. It's shown to be flexible enough to be able to handle very, very, very important and, I shouldn't say revolutionary, but big changes in our environment, such as the COVID-19 pandemic and Russia's war against Ukraine. Within some areas, we think the work can be strengthened going forward. Two such areas are human rights aspects of new technologies, internet closures, human rights online, disinformation or foreign information manipulation, censorship, and so on, as well as public communication, public diplomacy. We think that the European Union can and should do more there, and we need to focus a bit extra on that during the rest of the implementation of the action plan. We also need to strengthen our work with the so-called middle ground countries or middle powers or whatever you call them, and we need to be smarter in our outreach with them. This has really been brought to the fore by the war that Russia is conducting against Ukraine. It's made it more difficult, but also more important, and I think we have stepped up. I think we have improved. I think we're communicating better today than we did in the spring. Partly shocked by votes in the General Assembly and so on that didn't go as well as we'd hoped. I think that communication today is smarter, slightly more humble, but no less clear, to be honest. And that's a job that we all have to do and keep adapting. Again, we also want to promote an inclusive approach that includes not least civil society, but also other stakeholders. And I think finally, the recommendation that the Council conclusions that we will be looking at should be political in their messaging, which IDEA says. I think that's also very much our view as well. They need to be clear and be helpful and be usable for how we move forward for the coming years. I'll stop there. Thank you.
That deserves an applause indeed. Thank you very much, Ambassador. I think you touched upon many recommendations of the report, so that is really wonderful, and we're happy to further follow up on that and dig a bit deeper. If I may ask one follow-up question. In the report, there's also considerations around the ownership from member states, and of course, Sweden is a country that is used to lead political discussions on democracy, and indeed in an inclusive way, as you also touched upon that. But if you see any space in terms of process, how you think we could foster that member state ownership of the action plan? Would you have any ideas regarding that?
Nothing very exciting. I think it's hard work. I think we need to make sure that that human rights and democracy concerns are indeed integrated, and that we can take some help, of course, from those working groups that are working on it on a daily and weekly basis. But certainly, there is a responsibility on all of us. The EAS, certainly, when it comes to foreign and security policy, to make sure that human rights and democracy concerns are front and center. My committee is important, but there are also many, many others. And that we have a frank and open dialogue when we see that individual member states don't show full commitment. I think that's important. And as I said from the outset, that we're honest with each other when there are policy objectives that clash, and where we have to make choices, and they're difficult choices, but let's at least put them up front so we know what we're doing, and not try to sort of hide them away. Thanks.
Much, and I'm thinking out loud. You referred to one of the recommendations being the process, making it more inclusive by gathering also civil society in one forum with member states as from the development process, and that could be also perhaps another way to improve that joint ownership, because you connect all kinds of actors both on design and later on implementation. So thank you very much for that. Next speaker, if I may already, let's move to Neal, who is the head of division for democracy and electoral observation in the European External Action Service as of September 2022. And we actually had the honor to already host Neal on a panel during his very first week in office. And now we are 6 months later, so I'm wondering, 5 months later, I am wondering, did it make you more decided or more realistic on democracy objectives? And we will be happy to hear the tone of you. At least one recommendation has also already been started off with implementation, that is to increase the capacity on several sites, including on EAS site, and Sweden, thanks to the presidency, could also second a person to the team, to the democracy team. So that is something we could advise many member states to do in the future. It's perhaps a nice one. Neal, if you could, I pass on the floor to you for your opening statement, and it would perhaps be great if you could remind us a bit of those basics of the action plan. So what are the main objectives of that action plan midterm review, and which recommendations, if you link it to the report, would you find particularly relevant in view of that midterm review, knowing that, of course, many of them focus already on the next action plan? Thank you.
For sure. Yeah. Thank you, Marilyn, and thank you for the human resources advert at the end of your intervention. Ambassador Lindvall pointed out that it's not the best panel to be in, the fourth panel on the day, but in addition, when there are 10 speakers from the EU institutions on the same day, to be the 9th in that order is not necessarily the best place to be either, particularly when the following speaker is the Vice President of the European Commission. In addition to that, Ken Godfrey usefully pointed out the disconnect between speeches and policy reality, so it's a nice place to be talking in. But I'm very glad to be on this panel together with two member state ambassadors because, of course, as you all know, EU foreign policy is based on unanimity, so we can always only go as fast or as slow as the 27 member states allow us to go. Thank you to IDEA and to the Swedish presidency for organizing this event, and thanks, I think, as has been said many times before, for the excellent report. There is, of course, no presidency in foreign policy, but I think it's undeniable that the Swedish presidency's accent and importance given to democracy provides an important momentum to the work that we all do and in protecting and strengthening democracy globally and within the European Union. It is clear that in the past decade, the EU's support for democracy has moved up the political agenda. And at the EU level, we aim to promote an approach that makes this key central to both our own societies being more resilient and also outside to supporting those close to our borders and beyond. The current action plan was adopted in 2020. It's the third action plan in a row. I hope that none of you sleep on it, as Marilyn suggested earlier on, but there are 5 priorities in that action plan, which I will not list because if you do sleep on it, you know them. But I think what is important is that democracy is entrenched in all 5 of those chapters in the action plan, and that it is clear from the action plan that democracy and human rights are interlinked. The novelty, I think, of the third action plan was in particular that for the first time there's a dedicated chapter to democratic governance. So not only is it central to all 5 of the chapters, but there's a specific chapter on democratic governance. Of course, the action plan, the current action plan, started being implemented and has been implemented during a time of particular upheaval and turmoil, not only COVID-19, but also the war of aggression against Ukraine, which make it for a particularly complicated time to implement the action plan, but still, as the report points out, it is an extremely useful tool, and it is important that the EU is and remains the main provider of support for human rights and democracy worldwide. The midterm review, as Marilyn pointed out, is aimed to be finalized and delivered in June. The recommendations contained in the report from IDEA are extremely useful in this regard. They are one of many, many inputs that we are receiving from outside organizations, from civil society, from member states, and from others. And I think if we come specifically to the process, I think this was one of Marilyn's questions, it is important that we remain focused on the implementation of the current action plan. The midterm review is a strategic exercise, but it will not lead to a revision of the current action plan. The point of the midterm review is to assess the successes and the failures or possible challenges of the implementation so far, to adapt the priority areas for the remaining 2 years, but then, of course, to provide elements for the next and future action plan. In this process, the issue highlighted by IDEA and by others of inclusiveness is very much taken on board. Many in this room know that we have been consulting member states, EU institutions, our delegations, civil society organizations, networks of civil society organizations. We had a first consultation in June last year, and we will be having a second open consultation in March this year. As Marilyn pointed out, even though this is pretty much cuisine interne of institutional working, there will be a working document sent to member states in May, and council conclusions to be adopted in June. And though those will be very short council conclusions, I think they will be of essential importance to highlight again the EU's attachment to democracy. Now, Marilyn also asked me to point possibly to some of the recommendations that we find most relevant. I think, first of all, I think it's important that IDEA recognizes, as does the report that also Ken Godfrey referred to earlier, to the leading role of the European Union and its member states in support for democracy worldwide. If we look at the recommendations in particular, I think as as Mikael mentioned earlier, the fact that democracy to be further mainstreamed into EU policies overall is important. I don't think we need to overshadow the important steps of the past few years, including the Council conclusions in 2019, but of course more and better can always be done, and hopefully, as I mentioned, the Council conclusions to come in June will go in that direction. I think also of the recommendations, the lines on digital and democracy, as has been mentioned by a number of speakers in the panels earlier today, will be of particular importance. Of course, as you know, the EU institutions have been working recently on a number of platforms and packages, including the Digital Services Act, the Code of Practice on Disinformation and others, but again, more and better can always be done. I think the focus on women and youth is of particular importance, as has been mentioned again earlier today. You know that the Commission has been doing a lot of work on the Summit for Democracy cohort on youth. And on gender, we have a gender action plan, which was to be further developed. And finally, well, not finally, but my final point for now is, amongst the points that you raised, the enhanced coordination between the institutions and member states. And I think that the Team Europe democracy exercises led by the Commission over the past few months in particular are of particular relevance to that. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. There is, yes, please. A lot of elements that we can work with, so thank you very much for those insights. If I may, I have a couple of burning questions, and they are a bit process-related as well, but also political. And now that you're here, you may want to shed a light on those. That is indeed so. The midterm review will come with Council conclusions. Of course, it rings a bell for many in the room who have also followed that process in 2019 that led to the renewed Council conclusions on democracy. And the last paragraph there says and calls on the ministers to convene regularly to discuss democracy issues. And we have seen that in the aftermath of that it's not so easy to organize that at council level. Do you expect now that there's a real momentum on democracy in the coming months, there is the Summit for Democracy coming up, there's the midterm review, and then indeed the next discussions. Do you foresee that such discussions could take place in the coming months?
Crystal ball gazing. I think it's more that the Council conclusions for the early summer will be very much on the midterm review. It will not be an attempt to have new Council conclusions on democracy. I think the fact that they were adopted in 2019, which is not a long time ago, is an important element to bear in mind. Of course, I think it will be for the High Representative and for Member States themselves to decide if they want to have a ministerial debate on the issue. But I think light on this question will be shed in discussions to be held in the Council working groups and in the PSC in the months to come. And I wouldn't be able to, let's say, preempt whether there will or won't be discussions at that level. Thanks.
And the quick last one is on the timing of the action plan. Among the recommendations is also to align it with the multi-annual financial instruments of the EU, logically, because that would, of course, facilitate a number of things. It has been quite convening in the last one, but that's not necessarily the same. Is that something that could be considered?
Considered, yes, for sure. As you know, the current action plan is until 2024. I think the ambition, of course, would certainly be to align the action plans with the instruments, though if we talk from experience and see the delays that took place and that many of you in the room witnessed on your skin on the delays on the funding for when the Indici instrument was adopted by the Commission and how long that took, I wouldn't be able to preempt now whether we will be able to succeed in that attempt to align policies and funding. Thanks.
Thank you very much for that. And let me also turn now. We have among us also Ambassador Delphine Borione, who was appointed Ambassador for Human Rights in February 2021 already. Throughout your career, you have held several bilateral and multilateral positions in areas such as politics, sustainable development, and economic, cultural, and educational cooperation, all types of topics that here and there were mentioned already in previous discussions in link with, in relation to democracy. So welcome, Ambassador, to the panel, and I pass on the floor to you for your opening statement.
Thank you very much, and I'm so pleased to be here with all of you, and I wish to thank very much IDEA International and also the Swedish presidency, and very happy to also, and thanks to Cecilia Ruin to have gathered also our colleagues, European ambassadors on human rights. We are a very active group, and it's great to be here. Thank you also for this reflection, very timely, in a moment where, and I will not discuss it further because we have talked about it since this morning, the challenges, the pushbacks, the threats that we can see on rule of law, on democracy worldwide. And we have a moral obligation, of course, to defend our values and principles based on the rule of law, democracy, human rights, but not only moral obligation. We have also an interest really for our societies, because we know that if not defended, it is a whole world order based on the UN Charter, on the Universal Declaration on Human Rights, which is at stake, and which would have terrible consequences in terms of peace, of security, not to speak about human development or human rights. So this midterm review is absolutely a great moment for thinking all together how to think of our EU action plan on human rights and democracy, waiting, of course, to the fundamental reshaping of the framework for 2025-29. There would be a lot of things, and I will not repeat. We had already had such a rich discussions in this morning, but to take those three priorities which were highlighted this morning on the review, which I thought were very relevant. Humility. Indeed, we have to take this with humility, also to respond to the criticism of arrogance, which is sometimes made to us, and in order to also listen to all our partners. Coherence. Of course, this would also allow us to respond to the issue of double standards that also are sometimes addressed to us, and that also make us to work on all the other dimensions of our cooperation, economic and social rights, fight against poverty, development cooperation, education, was also all these issues are so important. But that also means articulation with the other action plans and strategies that the EU has, such as a third plan of equality between women and men, the Equality Generation Forum. So this issue on women is very important. We have also mentioned youth, and of course the Team Europe initiative on democracy is an excellent tool to bring this coherence. Inclusivity was a third. Of course, necessity to involve and work with civil society, which are very often at the forefront of this combat on democracy and human rights. But also businesses. We mentioned this morning also the key role that business has with its corporate governance to bring values, to bring good practices, and with the huge impact, economic, social, economic and financial, but also at the social dimension is absolutely key. When we speak about inclusivity, it's also, of course, within the EU. Neal mentioned that, of course, we have to work with all the member states. It's very important to bring at its pedagogical value also on discussing all together to bring a consensus, and that also allow everyone to be really on board. let me highlight two issues which we feel are very important. The human rights dimension of this plan, let me allow it because we spoke a lot of democracy, and of course human rights, because it's the rights-based approach that we have included in all our field of cooperation development really needs to be pursued. It's absolutely key to bring this rights approach. And also the place and the support that we have to give to the human rights defenders, because they are at the forefront, as I said, of this fight. They take risks, and we really have an obligation to protect and help them. Another challenge, and we also worked a lot, we discussed that a lot, is an information challenge. Digital dimension is so important when we see infodemia, the manipulation of information, and also manipulation of history. We have seen that with Ukraine. And all these manipulations are dividing our own societies also, and we have to be very careful of that. They are weakening cohesion in order, and also, of course, to undermine our values abroad. So we really have to unite in acting to react to that. We mentioned different online coalition, Freedom Online Coalition. There is an information Information and Democracy Partnership. There are the Christchurch Local Action. There are other mechanisms. It's absolutely key that we are taking this dimension very seriously in order to counter all this misinformation. And the communication dimension in relation to that is very important. Very often we think we know that people know what we are doing, but we don't do it enough. And that very often the EU action or the member states action are not enough also promoted in order to also illustrate the benefits of democracy, illustrate the benefits of human rights and of all our values. And that's very important to work on that. Outside, of course, with other countries, and in particular, I was struck by Yvonne Gilmore mention of those countries which are in the middle between the full democracy, those who don't want to hear about it, but those who are really, we have to work more and better with them. But also internally, in our own societies, because this temptation of authoritarianism has gained a lot in recent years. So now with the example of Russia, it has not so much success, but still we really have to work internally to promote these values of democracy and human rights and the universality of human rights. Just to finish, to highlight again how much France is committed to this democracy and human rights promotion. We really are convinced that we have to work on this democratic resilience in the countries to support those who are fighting for it and to work on all these dimensions so that we have a world which is better eager to resist to other temptation of authoritarianism and to also promote the values that we share. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Borione. And a quick follow-up question. We don't have too many minutes left, but in the previous panel we heard Cara MacDonald saying that having a multilateral system and tools for democracy would be important. And I link it a bit to your call, and you were speaking about linking it with human rights. Human rights does have such system. And do you see, because France, of course, is stepping up on democracy, democracy quite well. It was mentioned by a few other speakers. The development agencies, we heard that they're also mainstreaming democracy. Is it something that France, as an important country, also multilaterally seen, would see any space to build in democracy a bit better in those multilateral systems, to foster a bit the exchanges, the narrative, and building that common narrative, but also building common agendas on democracy? Would you see any space for that?
I think we have one that we all share, the United Nations. The UN Charter is our common basis, and we have the UN, all the UN mechanisms, the Human Rights Council. So that is very, very important. That's our common ground. And of course, we have also other mechanisms which can be at different configurations, and the Summit for Democracy and others. But let's not forget, yes, let's use all mechanisms that we have together.
Thank you very much. Yes, an important point to keep in mind. Also in relation to other recommendations, we heard it often that there are calls to also make better use of all the existing frameworks at hand. So thank you very much for that. We'll may turn back later if there is time for a few questions, but let me now introduce to you Lisbeth Pilegaard. Lisbeth is Executive Director of the Danish Institute for Parties and Democracy. She's also member of the Board of Governance and Chair of the Executive Committee of the European Endowment for Democracy. Lisbeth has over 20 years of leadership experience in a variety of different national and international organizations. So very welcome, warmly welcome, Lisbeth, and please go ahead for your opening statement.
Thank you so much, Marilyn, and thank you to IDEA and Sweden for inviting me and for getting us together today. I'll also be short because I think it's time for the audience to put some questions, so we'll have a bit of that dialogue that we all talk about that is important. Today, the Transparency International launched their corruption index, and 6 out of the 10 countries that are on the top 10 are EU countries. We can talk more about what that means and why and not, but I think the fundament that everyone has brought to the table today of what we as Europeans cherish of democracy and democratic values are essential to us. And when we look outside of the EU, and many of us who engage with democracy activists and grassroots organizations globally, they look to Europe. They look to Europe for hope, for aspirations, for a dream that one day could be their life, living in a free society where they can make free choices, where they can have elections without being killed, and so on. And I think it would be wonderful if we can help inspire our politicians to maintain this democratic oath of what we also owe to the rest of the world, the hope and the dreams. An action plan is lovely, but we have in many probably seen different kinds of action plans. Some become actions and some just become a plan and some become a piece of paper somewhere gathering a lot of dust. So what can we jointly do within this democracy society with all these different actors here today to ensure that an action plan is realistic, is bringing appetite to our governments and those that are going to implement it, and is useful and helpful in their daily lives. When I meet public servants in the EU delegations in many different of the world, it differs a lot of how they address democracy and how they have opportunities to react and support democracy actors. And I think the action plan and the future hopefully can give more concrete directions and help for those that are going to implement the action plan. We are here, and there's a lot of talk about the consultation and the inclusion of more actors and civil society, and there are not that many civil society represented today, hopefully among the actors. So what can we do for the future, hopefully, is to have much more, not only consultation, but I would say inclusion of other actors than the regular suspects that are in this room. I think instead of us developing policies, we need to ask also those that we are supporting, what do you need? What are your needs? And do it more needs-driven than our ideas. I also say this because I have worked in the democracy support environment for quite a while, and I think we need to look critically at the way we work. We need to find new ways of working. That goes for the larger democracy support environment, but I would also point at the EU, saying EU needs to look internally and critically on the toolbox, as many has talked about. What does really work? And again, put it up against for those who are the recipients of those different support mechanisms. It's all interlinked, as many have addressed. So how do we also ensure that the democracy agenda comes up on the priority list and not being pushed down by other competing agendas of energy, security, and so on? How do we manage to put it at the forefront also for our politicians to secure that? Finally, I would say that I think many of us, and the picture has been painted. We know it's under threat. Not everyone believes in the faith or the religion of democracy. How do we make sure that we go from being very defensive to be more offensive? Simply to go out there and make sure that the mechanisms, the support, the avenues for people, as you say, in countries that are in the middle or being pushed or threatened by others, that they see that this is an avenue that is possible for them. And we've talked about, so you mentioned education. How do we reach out to young people so they actually are having the right skills to be able to read, understand, and navigate in this environment of propaganda and manipulation that is happening to all of us. I'll finish there so we can have more dialogue, hopefully. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Lisbeth, and I have a follow-up question, but indeed I will keep it for later and see if there's questions from the room as well. Let me pass on the floor to Simon Papuashvili, who is Program Director of the International Partnership for Human Rights. IPHR is an independent, non-governmental organization that works closely together with civil society groups from different countries to raise human rights concerns at the international level and promote respect for the rights of vulnerable communities. Welcome to the panel, Simon, and we are happy to hear what the perspectives are on the action plan, the expectations you would have in that changed context, especially in the East with the war on Ukraine, whether that has changed your views on the context of the action plan and if that should have an impact on the midterm review and what is to be decided for the remainder of the implementation.
Thank you for setting the ground, Madam Chair. Before I delve directly into the action plan, I would like to speak about the contextual elements, some of which have been covered by previous speakers. Number one fact that we need to appreciate is that the future of global democracy and the rules-based international order is currently being decided in the battlefields of Ukraine. The outcome of this brutal war will determine what kind of world we live in and whether democracy will prevail over authoritarianism in this region, but also beyond this region. Unfortunately, this crisis at least partly, has been created by the ignorance of the European nations that have failed to adequately respond to the total obliteration of democracy in Russia for the past 20 plus years. The European response to sharp decline in democratic standards in Russia has been wishful, to say the least. For more than a decade, European leaders continue to naively believe that dialogue and engagement and the deepening of economic ties with Putin's regime would create mutual interdependence, which would ultimately make Russia a more predictable partner. From the perspective we have today, we can see clearly how hopelessly flawed this policy of engagement and dialogue really was. As many of you know, Russia has been actively undermining and countering democratic transition in the EU's eastern neighborhood. This has been and continues to be done through financing well-orchestrated disinformation campaigns that ignite anti-European sentiments, and by supporting and empowering authoritarian rulers such as Alexander Lukashenko in Belarus or Bidzina Ivanishvili, which is Georgia's de facto ruler. Despite this, for many years, the talk of human rights by the Western democracies has been little more than a lip service. While publicly expressing deep concerns, Europe's political and business leaders continued with business as usual, thereby normalizing Russia's deplorable human rights record. In the meantime, Putin's regime has used hundreds of billions in revenues it has received from the sale of fossil fuels to the EU countries to reinforce its grip on power, solidify its crackdown on dissent at home, and to undermine democratic political processes in neighborhood and beyond, including within the European Union itself. So what can the EU do to reverse this democratic backsliding and the broader, in Russia and in the broader Eastern Partnership region? A well-known Jewish proverb says, "Do not be wise in words, be wise in deeds." The EU institutions and member states must put actions behind their words. The European Union has both the leverage and the tools to promote democracy and respect for human rights in Eastern Partnership and other parts of the world. The critical question is, how long should economic and business interests be allowed to prevail over democratic values? This needs to change. We must properly appreciate that building a safe and prosperous society is impossible if human rights and good governance are not treated as a number one priority. In more concrete terms, if the EU and its member states would like to see a peaceful, democratic, and prosperous neighborhood, they must do everything they can to help Ukraine prevail over Russia's aggressive war and to help undo the damage that Putin's regime has done for the Russian society for over 20 years. While fully eliminating dependence on Russia's fossil fuels, the EU and the member states must reinforce their efforts to strengthen the institutional and legal framework for enforcing sanctions. This is necessary in order to undermine Putin's ability to finance its war of aggression. And so far we have seen that the sanctions enforcement mechanisms are far from being sufficient. Last but not least, the EU and its member states need to increase their efforts to reinforce international justice framework. International Criminal Court and 14 EU member states have opened criminal investigations into allegations of international crimes committed by the Russian forces and their proxies on the territory of Ukraine. We are soon going to celebrate 1 year since this brutal war. And the mastermind of these crimes has yet to be charged. I think that this clearly indicates the weaknesses in international justice system, which needs strengthening, and the European Union, as an actor that has been at the forefront of promoting strong and impactful system of international justice, can and should do more. Going back to the action plan, I have a few rather technical, probably, remarks that relate to the mid-term review. One remark, as someone who is being based in Brussels and who has been involved in one way or the other in the consultation process related to the adoption or evaluation of the impact of the action plan, I see that local civil society actors are often somehow not adequately involved in this process. The consultation mostly includes Brussels-based civil society groups, some of which are membership-based umbrella organizations that do consult with their local members, but very often the message is lost on the way. The second recommendation is to make deliverables more specific and measurable of the action plan, while keeping contents of this document general sometimes does allow for flexibility and adaptability, which is important for today's changing world, but at the same time, it's harder to seek any accountability for failure to deliver on the promises. So we need to make the action plan and its wording as concrete as possible. And the third point I would like to make is that when we are talking about the evaluation, we have to really focus on the impact and not on the outcomes. Because as we see, the assessment of the EU policy often does focus on procedural deliverables, and we sometimes miss the big picture, which is more important than some small details. I'll stop here and happy to take questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Simon. Very interesting. Again, many follow-up questions can be asked, but in the interest of time, let me turn to the room I think we have time for a quick Q&A round, but please keep your questions short if I may. And if I may, Ambassador Anne Goedert, please come in with a remark.
Does it work? Yes. Thank you. Thank you very much. And thank you very much for that very interesting panel and declaration from all of you. Just very quickly, as regards the midterm review and the action plan, I think we very much agree that it needs to be flexible. It showed the actual situation showed us that we need to have it flexible. But please let's not forget, and let's hope and let's work for an ambitious result. I think it's very important that we engage together, that we get that ambitious result. We know it's not always easy. Now, it's more a comment, and I very much agree with which has been said. It's absolutely essential that civil society, human rights defenders, NGOs are with us in that report. Just to tell you quickly, in Luxembourg, we have an interministerial committee on human rights where we see each other every 2 months or something, and we open up to civil society after that. So we have a constant engagement with them on all the different topics we discuss on policies we have. We are not always entirely on the same level of ambition, but we are getting there and we are listening. And I think if more countries, or maybe they do it, we have as well the input of national NGOs and civil society into this process. Now, something which is very important to us and to many others as well. We really hope in the evaluation now, in the midterm review, but as well in new plans, that the rights of women and girls and a gender lens will be maintained in the new text, in the new policies, while we design new policies, while we foresee this. We can't stress it. We can't stress it enough, and we have been talking about it, about that gender lens as well. The specific view we have to have about engagement, but as well, particularly perspective of the rights of children, and then again, human rights defenders, civil society. We have to listen to them, but we have to protect them as well. Very often they are in countries where we get information. Very often they are the last ones in countries where not many organizations are left anymore. And obviously we have to listen to them, but we have to protect them as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you for that call. I fear that we cannot have too many intervenants. Let me perhaps, I saw Antonello Valmobida and then also Ambassador Merisari for short interventions and questions. Thank you. And then perhaps we can have a last minute round for each of the panelists to come in with some final remarks before we close down the panel.
Thank you very much, Marilyn. Thank you also for the great opportunity today to meet and to discuss these topics. I'm Antonella Valmorbida, and I'm the Secretary General of ALDA, the European Association for Local Democracy, and also the chair of EPD. I think that maybe we can also, within the plan today and the medium-term review and the next steps, I wanted to raise the issue of the local democracy. We have not been touching the issue today. I think that decentralization is also part of deconcentrating the power, and that empowering local dimension of democracy as its own added value. It offers new opportunities, it offers proximity in democracy, it generates also working with civil society at the local level more opportunities, and this is something really that we see generating a lot of energy. It also identifies new practices of participation, so when we are talking about democracy being an infrastructure, I also think that decentralization is an infrastructure within that first framework. And I hope that we will be able to contribute in the action plan also in this direction. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. Noted well. And then Ambassador Rauno Merisari from Finland, please, for your reflection.
Thank you, Marilyn, and good afternoon, everybody. I'm Rauno Merisari, Ambassador at Large for Human Rights and Democracy at the Ministry for Foreign Affairs of Finland, and I represent also my government in the IDEA Council. To keep this quite short, of course, we fully support this work, what has been done so far to prepare the midterm review, and hope that the process could be kept as open and as inclusive as possible. And of course, this event is a very good example of that kind of approach. The action plan, we find it an overall framework and the strategic guidelines in relation to the EU human rights and democracy policy actions, so in bilateral relations with third countries and multilateral fora. But then action plan should be also used broadly in various EU policy questions, such as country strategies, crisis management, trade and development. And here I'm turning to the podium and maybe asking if you can somewhere give us some examples how we can take next steps in mainstreaming human rights and democracy better, for instance, in the business and the EU trade policy. The content of the action plan is as topical as ever. This has been mentioned many times, digitalization, climate change, business, human rights, etc. So this must continue to figure at EU discussions and priorities. And then also addressing shrinking space of civil society and support human rights defenders and democratic actors must continue. As regards economic, social and cultural rights, the action plan should be further developed. There are many ESG right-related questions that have been at the forefront, be it girls' right to education in Afghanistan, right to health during the COVID pandemic, or the right to food in many countries after Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine. So my question is that how we can better offer our narrative related to the economic, social and cultural rights and oppose Chinese approach which undermines and questions the universality of human rights. Then finally, it is extremely important that the action plan provides even more tools to address the pushback on gender equality and the LGBTIQ rights. So in these questions, the AP has a basic language, but cannot seen as a particularly strong document. So, for instance, the language of the EU gender action plans could be taken more on board. Thank you.
Thank you for that. I fear... yes, please. Is it one line? Because we need to close down, because I think the Commissioner is also coming.
Actually, it's a very simple question, but I just didn't want this question not to be put on record, because we are discussing the accountability, and I believe also we need to look more closely to accountability for gross violations of human rights, and look how we are in particular using, whether efficiently or not fully, the global human rights sanctions regime. And my question, since we raised this, Slovakia with other countries, whether actually in this situation we could expand it a little bit or create a new regime actually addressing major cases of corruption similar to Magnitsky Act. I know it's a difficult question.
So thank you very much, bringing in new emerging topics, because indeed it was raised. Antonella, what you said came back, and you will see that at the end of the report, in also the regional dialogue reports, it came up very often in those dialogues with civil society there. So there are a few solutions. May I ask the panelists, perhaps in a small minute, to give some last reflection, perhaps in answer of some of the questions of remarks that came in. Starting with Neal.
Thank you. Just a few points to touch upon. The further consultation of NGOs and CSO. I mean, I fully take the point, and there is always room for improvement. At the same time, I think the EU, for one, cannot be faulted for a civil society consultation, particularly compared to other legislators around the globe. But it's certainly the case that at the level of EU delegations, more can be done in terms of consulting local civil society in third countries. On the notion of having more specific or more country-specific deliverables for the action plan, for the future action plan, 2025-29, I would tend to disagree. I think the reason that they are successful is that it's a general text that is applicable worldwide, and simply the fact that it has to be agreed by 27 member states and then be applicable worldwide make it quite difficult to make it more country-specific or theme-specific. On the question of reinforcing, or rather maintaining aspects related to gender, women and girls in the next action plan, 2025-29, as I said, the midterm review now is not about reviewing the text. That will be for a later stage. But I can't really see a context where there wouldn't, or whether where the importance of issues related to women and girls would be diminished. I cannot see that happening for sure. So the maintenance would certainly be on the cards. As to the next steps, again, I think the midterm review will feed into a process which will be discussed with the Commission and with institutions and with member states, and it's too early to say how all these themes will be mainstreamed into an action plan which will be applicable from 2025. I think it's a bit too early for that.
Thank you very much. And if I may ask the others, if you can stay within the minutes or even less, that would be great. Yes, please, Ambassador.
So thank you for all the questions and new ideas brought. Maybe one point which is very important is accountability. Because that would also allow to respond to many issues, as we said, fight against corruption, access to justice, fight against impunity, and that's absolutely key to ensure this interaction and the fact that human rights and democracy are fully linked, and the fight against impunity is something which relate them. And I stop here.
Three short points. The private sector is certainly important, inclusion of that. We haven't really talked much about the SDGs and how they interact and how they could be also drive the UN Global Compact, where many private sectors are engaged in pushing agendas. And just interesting, I think private sector in some ways are advancing our politician when it comes to climate issues, migration and so on, and are pushing our political system to change. So interesting developments. We need to revive not only our democracies, but the trust in democracies, and in that also the political parties. We haven't talked much about this, the trust in our politicians, and the food chain into politics, leading to your point about decentralizing of the power and making engaging in politics both interesting and less threatening for our young people. Denmark being, in many ways very developed when it comes to democracy, majority of our youth have said that they have no democratic confidence. They don't believe that they have a room or a voice to engage, and they are not educated well enough to engage into our societies. So that food chain needs to be fixed and helped so that we actually have the politicians we want and a thriving democracy. Thank you.
Thank you, Lisbeth. And please.
Yeah, maybe a quick reflection on the question concerning sanctions. Well, as you probably know well, the targeted sanctions is an instrument which has been pioneered by the United States through Russia Magnitsky Act in 2012 and through Global Magnitsky Act in 2017. And the US approach from the very beginning has been to sanction both human rights abusers and corrupt individuals. And the reasoning behind this approach is that although corruption and human rights abuses go hand in hand, in practice, it also happens that not all corrupt individuals are human rights abusers. So if we want to augment the impact of targeted sanctions as a tool for foreign policy influence, then EU must consider adding corruption as one of the grounds for which it can sanction both persons and legal entities.
Thank you very much. And here we come at the end of this session. Thank you very much to all of you for the very interesting comments. We'll not recap it, but what we hear is, of course, a call to unity in action. And there's much openness for reinforcing that inclusion of civil society in action plan processes. So that is something we take away from this. And we will now turn to the closing session of this conference. And thank you so much for staying with us until the very end. It is very nice to see that. And thank you for your engagements and your interesting interventions as well. And we build on the dialogue, of course, in the weeks and months to come. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Dear participants, please join me in very warmly welcoming Commission Vice President Dubravka, Šuica and Christian Leffler as our distinguished speakers of the closing session. Thank you for coming here, visiting us. We have had a long conference day with extremely interesting sessions, and we fleshed out so many aspects of EU's democracy action, the action plan on human rights and democracy. And so this day is coming to an end, and you see that people are still on an active mode and very interested and keen to hear on what you will say during the closing remarks. You may all know the speakers, but the Commissioner, Vice President Dubravka Šuica is, of course, Vice President of the European Commission for Democracy and Demography. Before joining the college, she served as a member of the European Parliament, and for those who don't know that yet, Vice President Šuica was also mayor of that beautiful Dubrovnik in the past. Vice President, you spearheaded the Conference on the Future of Europe into a multi-year and multifaceted initiative that left many astonished by its impact. Building on those internal successes, the Commission is now also co-leading the Summit for Democracy cohort on deliberative democracy to share those experiences. And we heard that you will also have take a role in co-leading on the Defense of Democracy package that has been announced, and many friends in the room are of course also very interested in hearing how EU will protect European democracies ahead of the 2024 European elections. So with all this important expertise, we are of course thrilled that you agreed to deliver closing remarks at our conference, during which we launched a report on EU's external democracy action. So we are very keen to hear your role, how you think that EU could strengthen its role on democracy, both internally and externally, and what your perspectives are on that internal-external nexus that can be cherished and can improve also the impact of the joint action. So thank you very much. It's my great honor, Vice President Šuica, to invite you to the podium.
Thank you, dear Marilyn. Dear Christian, dear ladies and gentlemen, I'm more than honored to be with you today to speak on behalf of European Commission in my capacity, as you already said, in charge of Vice President for Democracy and Demography, whatever you may understand under this portfolio. Of course, I would like to thank the Swedish presidency and, of course, International IDEA for the invitation to join you today. And I also thank you for your own democratic resilience, because, as all of us say nowadays, we cannot take our democracy for granted. We agree that democracy must be at the top of our political agenda. So I'm really grateful to be here for two main reasons. First, International IDEA's report rightly identifies a new geopolitical reality and the increasing need for the political will to respond to this new reality. Secondly, this links to a key point of your report on building a new narrative on democracy. We must fully grasp the impact of our democratic actions inside our borders. And now, how this impact infuse our neighborhood? The manner in which we live our democracy within has both, as you said, internal and external impact. And this is good news, because democracy does not live and breathe in a vacuum. I'm convinced that we need to work together more than ever to find solutions to our collective problems, both within and across borders. And it must be acknowledged that globally we face a pivotal moment for democracy. Therefore, the Commission welcomes the Swedish presidency focus on democracy and anti-corruption. In 2019, Sweden contributed to reaching agreement on the Council conclusions on democracy and the ambitious plan on human rights and democracy. And International IDEA is a reliable and inspiring partner. And your report is evidence of this. There is clear merit in each of its 4 recommendations. They confirmed the need for building a democracy fit for the future, fit for all generations, because both old and young democracies face the same threats. 2 years ago, we looked on in horror as the Capitol in Washington, D.C. was attacked. Incredibly, the same scenes played out again in Brasilia a few weeks ago. While these events were physically distant, we should not assume Europe is immune. We can never take our democracy for granted once again. I insist on this because I myself was not born in a democracy. So I really value the benefits that it brings in particularly special way. As I said, democracy does not live in a vacuum. It depends on strong institutions that enjoy the trust of citizens. Equally, policy making cannot take place in vacuum. Everything we do inside our European Union crucially touches also the external. Nowhere is this more visible than with democracy. Take Russia's war of aggression in Ukraine. This is an attack on democracy, on freedom, on the sovereign decision to follow the path of European values. But even these values require that we renew our pledge to uphold them and continue building our democratic resilience within our societies. So I can agree with your recommendation on building a new narrative on democracy. Solidarity is key at all levels of governance to avoid an us versus them polarization, to counter the false and easy promises of autocratic narratives. Democracy must remain firmly at the top of the political agenda. It cannot be an optional topic, but one that recurs under future European Union presidency, thinking about Spain, Belgium, and so on. The Commission has taken deliberate steps to focus on democratic innovation in order to strengthen and reinforce our democratic ecosystem. This includes a new impulse to promote citizens' engagement, notably through the unique democratic experience on the Conference on the Future of Europe. There was a great deal of skepticism at the beginning. Ultimately, democracy itself won through, primarily because we, the European Commission, insisted on keeping citizens at the heart of the process. Citizens were the authors of the recommendations that initially fed into a plenary where they stood on equal footing with elected representatives and ministers, commissioners, social partners. And this experiment bore fruit. The 49 tangible proposals of the conference proved we were right to put our confidence in our citizens. Some say the conference is over. It is over. The deliberations of those 800 randomly selected citizens are over. The plenary sessions between citizens, politicians, and civil society are over. The multilingual digital platform is in information-only mode. However, the conference continues to inspire our work inside our borders. For example, the year's Commission work program for this year, over 80% of its new policy initiatives follow up on the Conference on the Future of Europe proposals, on topics ranging from mental health to financial services. And the conference continues to inspire outside our borders. One example being the citizens' assemblies of Montenegro. We have shared lessons learned across the globe in exchanges with partners from Chile and Indonesia. And the Summit for Democracy, we call it the Deliberative Democracy Cohort with Ireland. The summit has provided a much-needed innovative platform for inclusive international alliances, especially in the face of democratic backsliding. The Commission's political will is seen in how we embed citizens' panels in our policy making. What we wanted to achieve? We wanted to achieve to make European citizens feel that they can influence policy-making process in Europe. And this was our ultimate goal of the Conference on the Future of Europe. The first panel was or is on food waste. It has already started. 2 more on virtual worlds and learning mobility will follow in coming months. I must say, I'm proud that we are the first executive body anywhere in the world to have introduced these methods to our mainstream work. Once again, leading by doing. This is a humble narrative. Your report recommends using democracy as a guide in all European Union external policies. This is already happening. Perhaps we need to be more explicit about it. We have a good story to tell. We already mainstreamed the human rights-based approach. It includes democratic principles of participation, accountability, non-discrimination, as well as equality, empowering, and legality. In this spirit, countries wishing to join the European Union must undertake the necessary reforms. It is not only about including these principles on paper, but about a true commitment to implement them in a way that has a meaningful impact on the lives of our citizens. In this spirit, I welcome your references to the mid-term review of the European Union Action Plan on Human Rights and Democracy and its successor. By May, we hope, the Commission will review the plan to improve its implementation in a volatile geopolitical environment. It is an inclusive process where member states and civil society organizations are consulted and provide inputs. The Presidency will then propose Council conclusions in June. This will reinforce our political narrative and our commitment to human rights and to democracy. Your third recommendation is that the European Union should adopt an integrated approach to democracy support in external relations. We agree that democracy should be approached in a comprehensive manner. Democracy, rule of law, anti-corruption, and human rights are intrinsically linked. Last October, the Commission adopted the first ever Youth Action Plan in EU external action, and it responds to the call for greater participation and inclusion of the young generation, including children. It acknowledges their important role as civic and political actors. This complements our work on developing a child participation platform, which will enable children across the European Union to participate at all levels in decision-making. The platform will be operational this spring. We care about the children within the European Union, but also around the world, including, of course, in our neighborhood. The European Union is concerned by reports of forced transfers of unaccompanied children from Ukraine to Russian-occupied territory, or even to Russia itself. The Commission considers that it is crucial to ensure a proper collection of evidence, because this is the only way that we can ensure that there is accountability for these criminal acts. Our focus on younger people also links to your fourth recommendation on more inclusive and more gender and youth-responsive policymaking. Our exercises in participative and deliberative democracy are based on the principles of inclusion. 1/3 of the citizens in the European citizens panels are young people. When I say young, for us it's 16 to 25 years old. And the European Union Gender Action Plan includes women's political participation among key European priorities of action. And my concluding words will be on the need to defend democracy. This calls for a range of actions that need to be taken at all levels. An important aspect of it is building of democratic resilience from within, to bolster our societies and to help them to withstand the threats that attack democracy from various directions. In her State of the Union address last year, President von der Leyen announced a Defense of Democracy package. A key pillar will be a legislative proposal to protect citizens from foreign, covert, hostile interference. Hostile actors seek to use the institutions of democracy to weaken them from within. Therefore, besides countering the external factors, we must also build our democratic resilience from within. In a democracy, our greatest asset is our citizens. We must invest in fostering active citizenship and democratic participation across all generations and raising awareness about European civic space that has been evolving, because the European Union has created an unprecedented European democratic space which crosses ages, borders, cultures, and histories. It is a transnational space, and I believe that we have a moral duty to nurture, protect, and secure this European democratic space, and at all levels, European, national, regional, and local. To build democratic resilience from within, we must equip and educate citizens as they engage in democracy. In the same way they rightly feel that they are nationals of their country, it is important that they also value that what it means to be a citizen of the European Union. The two are fully complementary and indeed mutually enriching. So how do we sum up these reflections? We hear bad news about democracy. But the good news is that the European Union has a positive track record here. The good news is that citizens want to get involved. President von der Leyen has placed democracy at the forefront of this Commission's political agenda. Today's exchange helps to feed and nurture that political will. Most of you present here today had the greatest luck to be born in democracy. This is what I want to say. As I said earlier, this was not the case for me. Fighting for democracy meant that I had to live through a war. So I continue to fight to ensure that everyone can grow up free and safe, both inside and outside the Union, making democracy fit for the future. There is nothing better than democracy. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Vice President. Very wise words, and we all hear that the EU will have a very busy democracy agenda. That is for sure. And we also see clearly, and we also took it from the conversations earlier today, that the EU is getting ready to be more political on democracy as a priority that links our internal challenges with the external mission and the external action work. So we look forward to staying with and following very closely and contributing, each one of us, to the processes that EU is also opening up for other stakeholders. So let me pass on. If there is willingness and time for questions, I can double check it because we run a little slightly over time. Would there be any questions from the audience for the Commissioner? Very happy to take a few. Thank you. Ambassador from Mongolia, please, you have the floor.
Yeah. We have been covering a lot of topics here. It was really a comprehensive discussion. Thank you. But one thing I think we a little bit, so I have the need to tell it out about the press freedom. The fundamental issue for democracy we see is the press freedom as it is today. Because I am also born in a communist country, and we turn to democratic, and we know that what is the freedom of speech. And because freedom of speech, you can have freedom of speech, you can have press freedom, but it doesn't mean automatically you have free press. And that is something we have to change, we have to tackle. Otherwise, without this, anything we go is really not that what we want. Thank you.
Thank you. Would you like to react already or take a few other ones, please, Vice President?
Thank you for mentioning this question. When I said at the beginning that there is a new portfolio on democracy and demography, there is also another portfolio, which is rule of law, transparency and values. And it is led by my dear colleague, Vice President Commissioner Jourova. So she's in charge of this. And two of us are in charge of this democracy defense democracy package. So me on the side of democracy from within, and she on the side of foreign interference, fake news and press. So we are working together, we are aware of what you said. So without freedom of press, we cannot, of course, imagine true democracy. And this is what we are trying to do. It is some little bit strange that at this stage, at the beginning of third millennium, we have to fight for our democracy. But it is the case since there are threats for all over. You see, I mentioned the capital, I mentioned Brasilia, but we are very close to Ukraine and Russia, and we are aware that this is the moment to to cherish our democracy, to defend it, and to try to start teaching our children from the very early age. This is the reason why I mentioned children, from early age, to be responsive citizens who will take part and who will participate in democratic institutions. Otherwise, there is no democracy. And this is why we are saying that we are trying to defend democracy from within. Maybe sometimes hard to understand, but maybe we can speak about this in simpler terms in order to make people and our citizens understand. Of course, you are right. Once you are out of communism or former system, it doesn't mean automatically that you are democratic and that you act freely. So media are for us at the heart, and citizens again.
Thank you very much. Any other questions, please? And then Karen Fogg. It's in your armchair, so you take the left side microphone and then put it on in the armchair.
So you can hear me?
You will need to take it up in your hand.
I see.
That's it.
Sorry. Nora Viostic, Human Rights House Foundation. You mentioned that you will include civil society in the consultation on the reform of the action plan on human rights and democracy. How will you ensure that this is not just a ticking the box exercise, but that this will actually be meaningful inclusion of civil society?
First of all, we are not ticking the box at all, because on Conference of the Future of Europe, we included, as I said, all these politicians at different levels of governance. Of course, citizens, when I say all of us are citizens, but citizens from different strata of our society, and NGOs and all stakeholders, trade unions, but citizens were randomly selected. And now we have panels, which I mentioned, these citizens panels became or are becoming a part of our policy making. And we are again selecting citizens on randomly basis in order to have them with us when we ahead of each big legislation. So we are now trying to include citizens and to include deliberative democracy to be part of our policy-making process. So whatever we are doing from now on, ahead of each big legislation process, we will have citizens with us prior to start writing this legislation document. So for us, it is very important to show that it's not to abolish representative democracy. We are still fine with the MPs, with MEPs, but it is to empower them, to strengthen them, to show that there is no vacuum between two elections. If you have, for example, for European elections, you have 5 years. And nowadays, with all these digital gadgets, citizens are well informed in a second, in a minute. So you have to be all the time in contact with them. And this is what we are trying to do also with this, part of legislation which you mentioned. This is our idea. Hard to achieve, I have to be honest to you, hard to achieve, but we are also inviting all our citizens and all our authorities at local, regional, national level to follow us. Otherwise, I'm not sure whether we will succeed, but we are trying to do it. It's not only European level. I'm always saying we want to burst the Brussels bubble, which somehow exists. We want to show that Brussels bubble doesn't exist. Citizens are with us all the time, and this is our position. And this is what, of course, at the beginning, conference was envisaged to last 2 years. Then, due to COVID, it was only 1 year. But we still managed to achieve a success. And of course, we always need better communication. So media for us very important to multiply what we are doing. Sometimes not an easy task because media are not interested in regular business. They want to speak about different affairs. So this is a big issue. I'm not blaming anyone, but just to let you know that sometimes it's hard to have media with us on these regular processes. I'm not sure whether I replied to your question directly, but I was trying to reply on a broader.
We have one more more question, and thank you very much. For sure that the Brussels bubble indeed has been less strong and there is more connection with citizens surely after the process you led. We have one more question by Ms. Karen Fogg, former Secretary General of International IDEA. Karen, please.
Yes, thank you very much. Former Commission official too. Dear Commissioner, could we talk a little bit about the elephant in the room? The elephant in the room, Hungary. Hungary. From your position and your past experience, do you think that the European Union could have done more in the past 10, 15 years to develop what you call democratic resilience in Hungary or countries like Hungary? That's the first part. The second part is, does the Commission need more new, different instruments to develop democratic resilience in a country like Hungary? Thank you.
Thanks for this question. First of all, what is Commission? Is Commission inspector? Is Commission? What is Commission? Commission is at service of different member states and at service of our citizens. This is how I see what is Commission. Of course, when you mentioned this country, I'm not maybe entitled to talk about different member states now on behalf of Commission, but we know that there are some problems within that country, and of course we are monitoring this, and we have tools. First of all, we have this conditionality mechanism, as you know, and the money could not be distributed to this country without fulfilling these criteria, and milestones, not only for cohesion policy, for regional funding, but also for recovery and resilience fund, as you know. So we have tools at our disposal, and we are using these tools in the best possible way. We have also a rule of law report, as you know. This is completely new mechanism which we introduced 2 years ago, and in July every year we have rule of law report for Belgium and for Hungary, if you want me to be more explicit. And we are, of course, trying to, we have also European semester. We have different tools, and I think we are doing our job. Of course, when I say that we are trying to defend our democracy from within, this is also about that. So we know that there are populistic and autocratic tendencies in some member states, also in that one, but we are trying also to use all our tools which are at our disposal, and I think we will manage in the end. And in the end, when we say that your destiny is your hands, the destiny of people of Europe and people of Hungary is in the hands of citizens, in the hands of voters. This is the only, the best democratic exam which we have, so let's be patient.
Thank you very much, Commissioner, and we are very happy to see how the EU toolboxes, both internally and externally, on democracy are evolving. It was a topic that came up a couple of times to also build the international toolbox further next to the existing one on human rights. So if that concludes the question round, if that is fine, let me then turn to the next concluding remarks. Few of you may know that our Board of Advisors is chaired by a very familiar face, both in EU institutions and the full Brussels democracy community. I may welcome to the front our Chair of International IDEA's Board of Advisors, Christian Leffler, who will kindly conclude the conference discussions and help us building some of the takeaways that we can have. As former Secretary General of the European External Action Service and also previously served in DG INPA at the European Commission, Christian Leffler is a kind of powerhouse on its own, and he has an incredible network in EU institutions and beyond, and we thank you very much and in the past. We could count on your advice, and we will certainly do so in the months to come when we start working with the report's conclusions. So thank you very much, and I invite you to the floor for the concluding remarks.
Thank you very much. Is it all right if I stay here? Thank you for your very kind remarks, which I don't know whether they amuse me or whether I should believe them, but let's leave it at that. Now you've had the distinguished speaker, and now you will get the closing remarks. I'm not going to go through the whole laundry list of elements that we've talked about during the day. Many of you have already looked at the report, you know the issues, you've heard the interventions, the air is getting thin, you want to get home. So let me make a few reflections and point to a few issues that have come back recurrently in the discussion. If you bear with me, I would first, as a backdrop, say governance and democracy mean very different things to different people. And we have to bear that in mind when we engage with others, in other countries, in other contexts, to make sure that we really understand each other, which often we don't. Let me give you two brief examples, one top-down and one bottom-up, from my own experience. Once was a little over 20 years ago. I accompanied then Commissioner of External Relations Chris Patten to Iran. It was the first time ever a European commissioner went to that country. Almost the last time as well, because of the difficulties that have since appeared on many fronts. We knew we had to take up issues of fundamental rights and democracy, the lack thereof. We decided to do it with the approach, this is typical of Chris Patten and his intellectual approach, by raising the issue of separation of powers. Our first interlocutor was the reformist president, Mohammad Khatami. He understood perfectly, and we had a very rewarding discussion about the writings and reflections of Montesquieu and other aspects on the division of power, the separation of powers. We then went to see Rafsanjani, former Speaker of the Parliament, then chair of what was called the Facilitation Council. He took this message with a broad smile and said, yes, I know exactly about separation of powers. I do it every day. I divide everyone, and then I see what I can get out of it. And our third interlocutor was, I can't remember his name, he was an Ayatollah whose views were as dark as his turban, who was the chief judiciary. And he just looked at us and said, separation of powers. But I have the power, why should I separate it? That shows you a little bit the challenges we are up to when we deal with governments that don't believe in giving people a voice. The second example was an exchange at a very local level in a country in Central Africa that I will not mention the name of, where they were preparing for elections. And we had an encounter literally at the village level, and we asked people what they thought about elections. And they got really enthusiastic and said, yes, yes, yes. I mean, they like democracy, they like elections. It's great, we should have them more often. We said, well, yeah, no, wow. Until someone explained, yeah, elections are really nice because we line up, I go and vote, I get a beer. Then I go to the back of the queue, I vote again, I get another beer. So yes, they like elections, but maybe not the way we would like to see them. So we have to develop the message, we have to think through, and we have to make democracy, I think that's come through in the discussion during the day, we have to make democracy relevant, tangible and relevant to the people who we seek to work with, the people we seek to address. We have to show that it delivers. That will bring me in a second to the issue of an integrated approach and all the rest of it. We have to work to mobilize opinion, so one has to work on media and the independence of the media and the transparency of institutions. We have to work, and that's been mentioned many times, with young people. They are the ones who have to see that this delivers. They are the ones who have to be motivated. Someone said in the course of the discussion that authoritarian regimes don't care about young people. I disagree. They do, but they see them as a threat. In a democracy, you see them as a potential, as a possibility, as an opportunity. That's the difference. Authoritarian regimes want to sit on the young people like on everybody else because they're afraid of them. We have to work to show how they are an opportunity for their society, but how also the structures, the processes in that society are an opportunity for them. And that's where sometimes we've not been able to fully build the message. And that's why the issues of a comprehensive policy approach, an integrated approach, is so important. We've heard a lot about it in combining policies. That works both across EU policies and between the EU and its member states and their respective policies, hence the importance of the Team Europe approach. But I was also gratified to hear the two members of parliament who spoke here today, one from the sort of left, Heidi Hautala of the Green Party. I don't know whether we would fully qualify the Green Party as part of the left in the European Parliament. That's where they mostly vote. And one from the right, from the EPP. But they both highlighted the importance of linking this work and cooperation work with other external policies, notably the economic ones. The global gateway, trade, the GSP, other elements. Because that's one way of showing that democracy can deliver. I think it was Thomas Toubé who said, democracies generate investment, and investments generate growth. Investors prefer to put their money in a country where the government is accountable. And generally, accountable governments are also more resilient to shocks and changes. Autocracies are rigid, but fragile and unpredictable in how they deal with people like investors. So that's the importance of linking the policies, bringing them together, showing how we can work on a broad front where the socioeconomic aspects are as important as the procedural or structural ones of governance. The coherence has of course been mentioned. It's one of the holy grails of EU external policy to work on increased coherence. And many have said, rightly, it's a nice ambition at least, that democracy should be the guiding light and we must be stronger in saying that's what determines where external policy should go. I say that would be good, but we live in the real world and we have many conflicting interests. And we know that it's not always going to be the case. I think the important thing is that it needs to be a strong benchmark in every aspect of external policy. And it needs, therefore, to be one against which you measure the compromises you have to make. You recognize and manage the policy clashes that will inevitably arise. But you do not file the nice issues of fundamental rights and democracy away in a cabinet and say, we'll deal with those another day. They have to be there constantly as a reference point, a benchmark, and an ambition, of course. Inclusion was a constant theme during the day too, rightly so. I've mentioned already the importance of working with young people and other groups. Minority groups, I think, is one that has maybe not been mentioned as often as it might have been. The inclusion works at all levels and in different ways. Working with civil society has come up many times, the civil society consultation, as you've mentioned, to Vice President, equally working at local governments level, because bringing it down there almost inevitably becomes inclusive. It becomes tangible to people. It's about very concrete local issues, and it's a way of mobilizing interest. That's more difficult for the European Union because it is at once or twice or even three levels removed from that local level. But one can still get there, and one can still work on local governance issues in different ways. Inclusion can also come through new innovative approaches, the citizen consultations that you mentioned, and the experiences drawn now from the Conference on the Future of Europe, to look at how that can draw in more people in the future. Humility in our approach. I agree with that. Sensitivity, and that brings me back to the original point as well, how we understood or not understood and how we're seen by our interlocutors. And that should come with a dose of humility. We should listen, we should take note, but we should not be too shy about the principles and values that we stand for. And that, yes, we do try to project as a principle or a value, not as a rigid model across the world. There too, I recall an instance 4 or 5 years ago. There was a panel I was at European Development Days with civil society. There was European civil society, African, Asian, and Latin American civil society. And we were talking about some of these issues on governance. And somewhat to my surprise, many of the representatives of European civil society, they said, they brought in a kind of cultural relativism to say, yeah, but we mustn't force our values on others. We must understand that they want to develop their societies in a different direction. The others listened politely to this. But at the end of the discussion, I think it was one of the representatives of African civil society who said, whatever you do, don't forget your values. You are the only ones left standing. This was during Trump's year in the US. If we can't look to you, where do we look? I think that's important to bear in mind too, because when we say, who are we talking to? When we talk to governments or authorities, they will quite readily bring out the argument of cultural relativism and say, we don't understand. When you talk to their people, they are much less likely to do so, particularly if we can link it to how democracy delivers a better life to them. So it's a fine balance to strike between that humility and keeping, nevertheless, in perspective what we really stand for, what we believe we stand for, at least what I believe we stand for. Now, I've spoken too long. I think that we've seen, and we certainly see in this excellent report, that there's a lot of work to be done. It's ongoing work on a very broad agenda and a constantly evolving agenda. I think, Kevin, in your introduction this morning, you pointed to democracy as a universal aspiration based on, and I quote you, eternal values, but one where our efforts and any progress we make is transitory. We have to renew those efforts and reinvent what we do all the time. It's a constant, ongoing process. With that, I would wish the Swedish presidency in the Council, together with the Commission and the EAS, good luck with the mid-term review. Good luck with formulating ambitious conclusions by June. And I would also, because of that ongoing process, wish the best of luck to those who follow.
Close this conference with that important call to make democracy tangible and relevant and to integrate it in other policies out of its value, but also out of own interest. So a heartfelt thank you, Commission Vice President Šuica and Christian Leffler, for your words. For the next months, we will be seeking partnerships on the project. We will be presenting the report in various institutional bodies, but another thing is to create real impact. So we would like to ally with you on that, and please come back to us with all your remarks on the report. Join me for last time in warmly congratulating the project team and co-authors Charles Brasseur, Vera Pachta and Chiara Grigolo for the report. Thank you very much for your tireless efforts over the past 8 months and for accommodating every advice or request from numerous sides. And I know that the next months will be equally busy probably with working with the results. So thank you also all colleagues from the Brussels team and the teams in Stockholm who helped to make this conference and the communication around it happen. And thank you again also to all the people that were consulted in the framework of this project, because the report is largely based on their inputs, and that was very valuable. So thank you very much. Our special thanks to the brilliant colleagues from the Swedish Ministry for Foreign Affairs. Thank you very much, Ambassador Cecilia, Moa, Amalia, Fanny, Ludwig, Joanna, Karl and Mathilde, for all the valuable support. And we also wish you all the best for the presidency. We are happy, of course, to stay in touch with that. And lastly, I thank the group of ambassadors for human rights and democracy at large for coming to Brussels, and good luck also with your further meetings in Brussels. Thank you very much now to everyone here online, also for staying with us until the very end, and we hope to welcome you back very soon for a next event. Thank you very much, and keep in touch on the work.